Thank you, President Weinberg, and thank you for talking about how Denison makes connections, because that's just what I wanted to do today. To connect what we're doing here today and what the graduates have been doing at Denison for the last 4 years to other days like this. It was on a day such as this, in 1946, that the poet W.H. Auden delivered his Phi Beta Kappa poem to the graduating class at Harvard. The poem proposed a new 10 commandments, updated for my father's generation of veterans who had just returned from World War II to face a world that Auden didn't much like, and which provoked him to outrageous tongue-in-cheek humor. Like much English humor, it may have been too dry for many people to get the joke, but one line from the poem went viral, taken as a serious comment on what many of us have studied here at Denison: social science. His exact words were these: "Thou shalt not sit with statisticians, nor commit a social science." The context of that line was the poem's general lament that truth had been replaced by useful knowledge in order to win the war. Social science was a part of the problem. Playful humanism was a part of the solution, said Auden with a wink. Yet his meaning was clear. To commit the sin of a social science was to help create a future with less liberty. In that same year, 1946, an Auschwitz survivor named Viktor Frankl published a book called Man's Search for Meaning. Considering he wouldn't have gotten out of Auschwitz until early 1945, that was a remarkable feat in many ways. Because Frankl was less concerned with liberty than with responsibility, his book called for a Statue of Liberty on the East Coast to be complemented by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. What he had learned in Auschwitz was that people who took responsibility for themselves and for others were more likely to survive in that living hell of a concentration camp than those who gave up and lost any sense of meaning or purpose in their lives. Whether they were guards or prisoners, those who had taken responsibility had gained meaning by which they saved their own lives. 2 decades after Auden's poem and Frankl's book had been published, I sat in Dr. David Woodyard's freshman seminar here at Denison in Fellows Hall discussing that book, Man's Search for Meaning. I'll never forget what a revelation that discussion was for me at that time. But had I read the Auden poem at the same time I read Frankl's book, I would have used it to challenge Auden's new commandment as missing the point about responsibility and the role of social science. It was reading Frankl, not Auden, that prepared me for the first week in my first job. And yes, there will be jobs after Denison, make no mistake. My first job after Denison, in my first week, had the very interesting challenge of the inmates in all 5 prisons in New York City seizing control of the prisons, taking over from their guards in a protest against waiting behind bars for their day in court. Some of the prisoners had been held in jail without bail for over 2 years, just as many prisoners are still today held in India and in South America. When the New York City police managed to retake all 5 prisons without a single life being lost, my job in the short run was to help develop ways to prevent further riots. It was complicated, and it required a lot of social science. So I went on to study that at Cambridge and at Yale, and remembered Frankel's book, not Autumn's poem. Over the next decade, while I was watching police respond to hundreds of incidents of minor domestic violence, usually, like singer Paul Simon's recent case in Connecticut, without serious injury. But I saw how many police officers had just given up on this widespread problem because they could not and would not believe that they could make any difference in the future of these abusive relationships. I sought my own meaning from their despair by designing an experiment to compare 3 different methods of police response to those incidents. Our first experiment in Minneapolis found that an on-the-spot arrest was most effective at reducing repeat offending. That research result made headlines in 300 newspapers. 28 states made arrests in those cases mandatory. Social science was lauded as heroic. But good science, as I learned at Denison, requires that repeated experiments show the same results. That was when social science became the villain, at least in this case. Because our second experiment, this time in Milwaukee, found that arrest had terribly backfired among men without jobs, causing their future domestic violence to double compared to giving them a warning. Nobody liked that result. The Get Tough solution was politically popular, and it stayed on the books, even when 3 more experiments showed the same bad result for unemployed offenders. There was even worse news to come. This week, we published a 23-year follow-up of the Milwaukee experiment. It showed that when police were randomly assigned to make arrests for domestic violence, the victims of those they arrested became far more likely to die of heart attacks and stress-related illness. The victims of those they arrested became far more likely to die prematurely. It may be that watching your spouse or partner be handcuffed and jailed can be a lethally traumatic experience. But something like the reverse may also be true. When my Australian colleagues asked to help test an ancient method of dealing with criminals that's now called restorative justice, I saw Frankel's search for meaning all over that idea. When crime victims and their criminals and their respective families are given several hours to talk about the harm that the crime has caused to the victim and the victim's family, the offenders find that experience far more traumatic than anything they ever experience in a courtroom. Many criminals are reduced to tears. Most apologize with a desperate plea for forgiveness. Some victims forgive them, others don't, but most victims feel much better for having heard the apology. Even better is what they want the offenders to do, which is to stop it, to get their lives in shape, and to turn themselves around. Going through that experience was wonderful for the victims. In London, the robbery and burglary victims had a 40% reduction in their post-traumatic stress symptoms that they suffered from the crime, a benefit especially pronounced for women victims. And the offenders, for their part, are far less likely to commit future crimes if they have these meetings with their victims than if they don't. Last November, British law was changed to allow restorative justice to become an integral part of the sentencing process. This Monday in Washington, a Capitol Hill symposium we'll discuss whether domestic violence laws should be modified based on the new evidence of the lethal effect these state laws may have on victims. Social science does not have all or even most of the answers, but it can try to share the responsibility for doing something meaningful about these problems. So what do you think? Was Auden right? Would we all be better off with less useful knowledge and more of what Auden called truth? I'm not against what he called truth, but I'm also not against useful knowledge, especially when we can all agree on the truth that crime is harmful and must be morally condemned, but that doesn't tell us what to do. How we do that condemnation remains the central question, one that has been answered over the last several centuries in ways that have become more humane and better tested. Much good evidence shows that violence in the North Atlantic nations has been falling dramatically over that time period. Over those centuries when the beginnings of social science emerged as part of the Enlightenment, centuries in which thinking behind the United States Constitution was developed and taught to those who wrote it, many of them in liberal arts colleges, much like the one that Denison later became. I am sure that while I was at Denison, I committed a lot of sins. Perhaps a few of you did as well. But one sin for which I will never repent is one that can give meaning to all of us: thinking scientifically about social policies. It is not just the profession of social science that Auden condemned, it is the idea that we all might do better by thinking about human misery with a more rational, fact-based framework. A core truth I believe in is the value of a liberal arts education, a Denison education, to help us all do what my late father said we should do, to just get along with each other. 75 years ago this month, my dad, like you, graduated from Denison. As evidence to support that claim, I hereby present his freshman beanie with the class of 1939 indicated on the beanie. His name was Donald L. Sherman, and he would approve this message. Thank you very much.